And we are entering into the next portion of our program. It is the Kaiser Permanente portion of our program. And here on the stand to introduce our first keynote speaker is the Chief Medical Officer at Kaiser's Santa Clara campus, Dr. Susan Smarr. Thank you, Doctor.
Great. Thank you so much, Russ. And I certainly have great confidence in the resiliency of Silicon Valley with seeing the good turnout here right in the middle of the flu season. So all of you are the hardy souls that make us the dynamic area that we are. As Russ mentioned, I'm the Chief Medical Officer and I'm an OBGYN physician at Kaiser in Santa Clara. And I'm also very proud to be on the board of directors of Joint Venture in Silicon Valley. Our Kaiser, Santa Clara, and San Jose medical centers are once again very, very proud to be sponsoring this segment of today's conference. As one of the 7,000 physicians in our Kaiser Permanente family, I'm also very, very proud of the care that we deliver that improves the health of the communities that we serve. One simple example is that we've decreased the risk of death by heart disease by over 30% by focusing on prevention in an integrated model. In particular, we're proud of the excellent quality that we provide that's won national awards, as well as the high-tech, high-touch, cutting-edge implementation of modern delivery systems. We know that a healthy economy is indeed a key to a healthy community. We also believe in joint venture and what they do as well. We think it's enormously important to have someone pulling the region together in the way that joint venture does. I think of it very much in the way that we use our integrated model where the entire care delivery team pulls together to improve the lives of our patients. And now you've just heard Joint Ventures President Russ Hancock brief us on the index. And he also discussed the special analytics section of the index, which is the white paper about some looming decisions that are facing our area. This portion of the conference that we're sponsoring builds on that foundation of information, and we're going to have a distinguished panel discuss whether it's time for the Bay Area to take a more regional approach to our planning and decision making. I have the honor of introducing the keynote speaker who will set the scene for that discussion. His name is Paul Saffo, and he is a technology futurist and forecaster who explores the dynamic of large-scale, long-term change. He's based at Discern Analytics and teaches at Stanford, and his essays are read by a worldwide audience. Rather than give Mr. Saffo a lengthy introduction, because you actually have his bio in your program, I'd rather tell you why we are so eager to have him speak to us and lead this discussion this morning. It's because he is a bold and expansive thinker, and these are really big problems that we're facing. I don't think any of us would disagree with that. It's clear that the kinds of challenges that Russ discussed a moment ago need new ways of thinking that are very different than the ways we have thought about these problems before. The usual approaches simply won't be good enough, not if we intend to continue to be the example of dynamism and innovation that we have been in our history. For these reasons, we wanted to bring someone who would enlighten our approach and expand our perspectives, and that would be Mr. Saffo. He is a great communicator, as you will see, and this is important when you're trying to turn ideas into action. So I'm very grateful that Mr. Saffo is joining us this morning. Please help me welcome him to the stage now, Mr. Paul Saffo.
I'm going to try this podium. Light's better. Good morning. It is wonderful to be here and share a few thoughts about where I think we're headed. Let me begin with this image. This is a detail of a map that's on the wall in my office. It was printed in 1702, and it was designed by Captain Edmund Halley of the comet fame. He would go on to be Astronomer Royal and of course, discover that famous comet. And note the legend, because hidden in this map are two things that I think matter most to our future. The first one is myth, and the other one is geography. But just take a second and read the legend on this map. a new and correct sea chart of the whole world, so on and so on. But that new and correct part in particular is important. This was a very accurate map. It was revolutionary. It was the first one to show compass, or what they called compass variations at the time, what we call declination today, which is rather important if you're trying to get one from one port to another. And it is revolutionary, but what about that California part? You know, this is 1702, and California is still depicted as an island. And in fact, California would be depicted as an island on maps well into the 1700s. But, you know, I look at California as an island, and I look at the new and correct part, and it kind of reminds me, I'm an inveterate early adopter, and it kind of reminds me of the marketing material of more than one product I bought over the years in Silicon Valley. You know, the Newton, Bob, Lisa, Windows 2. You know, yes, well, maybe it's not exactly correct. But what's amazing about this, and especially odd, was that California was definitively determined not to be an island way back in 1539 by Francisco de Ulloa. And yet the idea of California as an island persisted long past when everybody should have realized, in fact, it was not an island. Well, this persistent imperfection on our maps made the maps, of course, useless to navigators, but it is absolutely invaluable to the conversation we're having today, because the reasons why California was shown as an island for so long points to the real deep origins of the myths that led to the creation of Silicon Valley and remain the secret to our reinvention and growth today. Specifically, California as an island, that idea, dates all the way back to about 1504. It was a book, think back to the early 1500s. It was a moment not unlike today. We were in the middle of a vast media revolution triggered by the invention of movable type by Gutenberg, and by 1500 people were setting up print shops all over Europe. And in Spain, there was a very successful publisher, García Ordóñez de Montalvo, who was going around repurposing a lot of old stuff, and one of them was this book, The Amadís de Gaula. And it was so successful and so popular, he decided to write a fifth sequel, the Sergas de Esplandian. So, in essence, Ordóñez de Montalvo was the Daniel Steele of his age, churning out pot boilers. I mean, this wasn't just a bad book. This was a singularly bad pot boiler of a book. It was so bad you'd want to roll up a newspaper and shake it at the book and go, bad book. You know, but it was also the guilty pleasure of, you know, young men in Spain, because it was stories of chivalric behavior and adventures and all that stuff. So it was red meat for, you know, young testosterone-laden bucks in Spain. And it went through countless editions. In fact, it was still in print. The Sergas de Esplandian, The Adventures of Esplandian, was still in print 100 years later, and by then the whole genre, the so-called libros de caballería, had become something of a joke, and in fact inspired Cervantes to write Quixote in 1605, which we all forget was actually meant as a parody. But back to the Sergas de Esplandian. There is one passage in the Sergas that I want to read to you. It goes, "Know that on the right hand from the Indies exists an island called California, very close to a side of the earthly paradise." Now pause there, because that phrase, the side of the earthly paradise, anybody in the marketing business here, that is probably the single most marketing phrase in the history of Western civilization, because it is shorthand for the Garden of Eden. It is the phrase that Columbus used to close the yuppie king and queen, Isabella and Ferdinand, on his expedition. So I continue. Very close to the earthly paradise, and it was populated by Amazons. Their island was the strongest in the world, with its cliffs and rocky shores. Their weapons were golden, and so were the harnesses of the wild beasts. They had nothing less than flying griffins in the story, that they were accustomed to domesticate and ride because there was no other metal in the island than gold. You know, for the tweet of 1504, that would have read, "Griffins, girls, and gold." And it could just as easily have been written by a PR flack at Southern Pacific in the 1890s trying to attract people to California. Well, that is California's creation myth. And it has, was read by all the young adventurers then. And in fact, it was what inspired Cortez to name our region California when he traveled to Baja California in 1504. Simply put, California existed as a myth, as a place of adventure, wealth, and opportunity to change the world long before it existed in fact. And that myth has been drawing people to our island for centuries. Among the earliest, of course, was Sir Francis Drake in 1579, landed somewhere near here, named it New Albion, and of course, thank God, Russ mentioned the fog at SFO. I just want to say, thank God for fog in the Golden Gate. Because if the Golden Gate had not been foggy, Sir Francis would have sailed into this bay, and instead of having good Mexican restaurants, we would all be eating really bad English food. But beyond Drake, what you start to see is that the pace of people being drawn to this place begins to accelerate. California absorbs the myth and starts creating myths of its own. There were the 49ers, and, I forgot to mention Cortez. There were the 49ers, and this is where the myth really begins to accelerate. People coming from everywhere, and they discover that, well, at least the gold part of the Esplandian myth is real, though the state at the time was a little short on women. And we can see Silicon Valley innovation happening in the gold fields. Entrepreneurs like Levi Strauss and Adolf Sutro and his tunnel opening up the Comstock lode. And this also marked the first moment in time when Silicon Valley helped rescue the rest of the country. Because, of course, without the mercury mines in the Almaden, it would have been much harder to refine the gold in the mother lode, enriching the rest of the country. So now consider some of the later revolutions and what happened. People have been coming from elsewhere to here forever. Edison, of course, invented movies in New Jersey, but the industry ended up here in California. And by the way, it's a little detail on the story that Hollywood's connection to Silicon Valley is oft overlooked. The industry at one point almost started up here. But one of the reasons why they went to Southern California instead of here was that all of the producers on Broadway, when the movie technology arrived, they thought, oh, we're dead. This is going to kill our business. We have to get into movies. So they went to Edison to license his technology, and he said, I'm not sharing my technology with you. And so he said, oh, what the heck? We have no choice. Silicon Valley style, we'll just violate his patents. And so he said, well, we better do it far away from New York and all of Edison's lawyers. So he said, California looks pretty good, and they checked out the state, and the sunlight looks pretty good. LA had one advantage over Silicon Valley, and that was it was close enough to the Mexican border that when they heard that Edison's lawyers would be heading west, they could pop across the border until things cool off. I think that's the only reason why we don't have Hollywood up here. But move on to other industries. The Wrights flew in 1904. Kitty Hawk, East Coast. But of course, the industry took off here in California because the world changers didn't want to be in the Carolinas. They wanted to be here in the island of California. This is a picture of a young Donald Douglas Sr., founder of Douglas Aircraft, one of the cornerstone companies of the aerospace industry. And men like Douglas would be absolutely perfect fit-ins in Silicon Valley today because just like Silicon Valley today, they exhibited Silicon Valley-style entrepreneurial attitudes, like disrespect of establishment. Here's the proof. I don't think this has ever been shown before. This is Don's algebra book from his first year as a midshipman at Annapolis at the U.S. Naval Academy. And he's changed the title. I think you can all see this. It's Impractical Algebra, prepared for the shipment, and then warranted to contain full amount of, a word I can't say from stage, none better. You get the idea. Just like Silicon Valley, Mike Murphy has said Silicon Valley is a place that eats its old. Well, that's the entrepreneurial spirit. Moving on, of course, in 1947, the transistor was invented, but it was invented in New Jersey, but it took off here, not just because of Shockley's mom living in the valley, but because of the myth of California and the work of Fred Terman and others saying, this is the place to build an industry. And also as part of the myth, thank God for Shockley's managerial incompetence. It is what established another piece of this building myth of Silicon Valley, that one can walk out the door, down the street, and start a company next to your former employer. Well, more recently, the internet was of course, ordered by the warlords, but it was built here. And the web was created on the Swiss-French border by Tim Berners-Lee, but the revolution happened in Silicon Valley. This is what happens with myth. The power of Esplandion's story of California became a myth that kept snowballing and growing. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy that we have been trying to fill ever since. Myths guide our future in the same way that maps guide explorers. Maps, compasses, navigational instruments are what explorers use in geography. Myths are what we use as the reference stars to guide us forward. The thing to keep in mind today as we dive deeper into this topic is we had the good fortune of building on a powerful myth that we have added to. But myths also need tending as much as infrastructure. And as we think about policies and infrastructure and human capital, we have to pay attention to keeping the right myths alive. Now, I mentioned this map, to me, evoked two thoughts about the future of Silicon Valley. The first was myth. The second one is geography. This map has a lot to reveal about our geography. California is, of course, not an island, but in a sense, today, California is, in fact, breaking away from the rest of the United States because of a very profound global shift. Power in this century is devolving away from nation states, and it is moving outwards. It's moving away from capitals to borders, and outwards and downwards to regions and city-states. California, if it were a country, of course, would be the world's 7th largest economy. And that's a tempting unit of reference to think about. But if you think about it, even California is too big to make sense as a single independent entity. The real nexus of power in this century is moving from nation states to city states. California, or the Bay Area, is a good example. City states, both de facto, de jure, legally recognized city states with seats at the United Nations like Singapore, and also de facto city states, powerful regions, are the new basic unit of governance in the 21st century. They are, to this century, what the nation state was to the last. City-states are the powerful nexus of economy, commerce, culture, and identity. So what about our Bay Area? Well, I think we actually already are a city-state. We just need to acknowledge it. A couple of dimensions to think about. First of all, we're not an island, but of course we are a distinct geography. We're defined by a central bay. we're bordered by mountains. And there's no sign that says you're now entering the Bay Area. But let's face it, we all know when we go to Sacramento and we're heading home, we know when we're in the Bay Area. The second one is that we have a distinct outsized economy. As Russ mentioned, we're now the world's 13th largest economy. That makes us bigger than Switzerland, Sweden, and Saudi Arabia. Third, we have an outsized business reputation. Cities may be small, city-states may be small, but their reputations are global. Hong Kong's reputation is synonymous with trade. Singapore's reputation is synonymous with corruption-free pragmatism. And Dubai has got the reputation of exuberant wheeling and dealing and large buildings. The Bay Area, our reputation is one of entrepreneurial innovation and high technology. That's why people keep coming here. Fourth, a good city-state has a distinct brand and high social cohesion. Clearly in Singapore and in Silicon Valley, we have that shared vision of future-looking innovation, love of change, concern for the environment. And of course, also, just as Singapore jokes about its sometimes oppressive social engineering, we also joke about ourselves, whether it's Berkeley or the SF supervisors, but we're also quick to defend where we live. Fifth, we have a good city-state always has awkward relations with its neighbors. Singapore has Malaysia, we have Los Angeles. And sixth, a city-state is defined by cohesive, pragmatic governments. This is where we could work a little more on this. We have a good start with some regional entities, BART, ABAG, but this is where we need to work more. Now, I'm not arguing that we should secede from California. And, they have our water, it wouldn't work. But rather, we need to rethink our relations, not just with our neighbors to the south, not just with the state, not just with our country, but our relations with entities around the world. We need to step up to a new leadership position. With that in mind, note that nations don't disappear, and they're not going to disappear in this century replaced by city-states. But now regions and city-states in particular will hold the power. We're a city-state, we should act like it. And as I said, we need to think like a region, not a mere collection of cities. Some specific steps that we need to think about. First, take our regional identity seriously. And I think there's encouraging news there. Take the 49ers. They're moving down here to San Jose. I haven't heard anyone calling them the San Jose 49ers. Santa Clara, sorry. I'm going to get to the fact that we have too many cities in a second. But I know with the 49ers that Ed Lee has been extraordinarily gracious about this and still considers them his 49ers, even though they're going to be like all the rest of us and, live one place and commute in another. Well, thinking about us as a single Bay Area region is a sensible way. This is a sensible indicator of where we need to go. That, of course, they're all of ours 49ers, wherever they happen to have their office. The second one is we got to work more on coordinating policy. We have to strengthen our regional bodies. We have to speak with one voice to Sacramento. And then we also have to look back in the recent past. And I don't know about you all, I am embarrassed by the way the Bay Area has behaved on the subject of high-speed rail. All the squabbling between cities, there's one category beyond NIMBYs. NIMBYs is not in my backyard. The category beyond, they're known as bananas. Build absolutely nothing anywhere. We look like a bunch of idiots around high-speed rail. And of course, as Russ hinted at, what we need is a real integrated multimodal transit system. We also need to think creatively about resource sharing here in our city-state. We made a good start in police and fire. There are boundary drops happening, fire mergers happening, but we need to have ambitious long-term goals. Since I mentioned fire, wouldn't it be nice if we had 1 or 2 region-wide fire departments? This is LA County. LA County Fire serves 4 million people. And because it's one agency, they have a fleet of 9 fire helicopters. Here in the Bay Area, we have 6.9 million people. We have no fire helicopters. The only fire helicopters we get from fire season is when CAL FIRE decides to park one up on Highway 17. If we could merge together into a larger entity, we could save money and have better services. Also, we see lots of city managers sharing and all that stuff. We're beginning to do a good job with that. We need to go a step further and say it's time to start thinking about boundary drops between counties. Why should you only be thinking about mergers between cities in the same county? And of course, we need to merge cities. We have too many cities in the Bay Area. I live in San Mateo County, the second smallest county in California. I think we have something like 52 cities. They're all little HO scale cities, turn of the century. We could start by cutting the number of cities in half. My town that I live in, Hillsborough, shouldn't exist. We should be part of Burlingame, or rather they should be part of us, or however you want to put it. But, we shop there already, so we should be the same city. We also need to cooperate more as a region. City-state thinking is not about going alone. It is the opposite, about creative, closer cooperation with other counties, with the state, at the national level, and the international level. And last of all, let me just go back one slide here. We talk about the Bay Area as 9 counties. I think that's too small. It turns out that city-states derive their power from the hinterlands they're associated with. Hong Kong's power comes from being at the bottom of the Pearl River Delta. Singapore is at the mouth of the Straits of Malacca. A big part, Silicon Valley isn't this thing dropped here by an alien spacecraft that has no relations with the people over the hill. They're very much part of our economy. Look at this map. Why don't we include Santa Cruz as part of the Bay Area? What about San Joaquin Valley? I mean, the people who work in Silicon Valley, they sleep there, for heaven's sake. We should think about expanding this notion of what the Bay Area city-state looks like. Now, the one other detail is it is important to note that, of course, the Bay Area is not the only city-state in California. In fact, I would argue that California has derived its power from being a collection of city-states. Bay Area is one. Los Angeles, of course, the LA Basin is another. And it's got a very distinct personality. We have high tech, they have Hollywood, they have aerospace and the like. We need to be partners with these folks. Of course, we're going to compete at some levels, but we need to be partners. And of course, from a geologic perspective, it's a good idea to be a partner because, as I know, we are on the east side of the San Andreas Fault, and they are on the west side of the San Andreas Fault. And the San Andreas Fault is creeping. I'm actually did a little measurement thanks to a friend of my property, and we are, the fault is moving north at about 2.5 inches a year. That's about as fast as your fingernails grow. So that means that LA is getting closer to us by 2.5 inches a year. And eventually we're going to be the same region, so we may as well get into the habit of thinking about being the same region now. But it's not just Los Angeles. There's a really interesting city-state south of Los Angeles, down the greater San Diego region. And it's an interesting case because the San Diego city-state is not just on the U.S. side of the border. It includes Mexicali. It includes Tijuana. There was a recent op-ed by Chris Anderson, the former head of Wired magazine. He has a startup company called DIY Drones. They do their engineering in San Diego. They do their manufacturing on the Mexican side of the border. And he's arguing that Tijuana and Mexicali are the Shenzhen to California. But also, it's an important indicator of what's happening, the shift of power from capitals, from centers to boundaries, from capitals to borders, and the dissolving nature of the nation state. We shouldn't call this the San Diego region. We should call it, I don't know, Cali Baja, Mexifornia, something like that, because the border doesn't want to exist. This isn't what you think. This was not a drug dealer. The DHS was not telling the truth. This was a supplier in Mexicali trying to get his products back to a company in San Diego and get around the backup at the San Ysidro border crossing, which, runs as much as 2 or 3 hours. Others are trying to use, UAVs to get the stuff over the border. This image is a reminder that in a world where we shift from nation state to city state and power shifts going on, the border simply does not want to exist. And the border fence, in my opinion, is as ineffective and wasteful as any other wall in history. It will go down in history alongside the Great Wall and the Maginot Line, because the border simply doesn't want to exist. And you're probably asking, why am I talking about San Diego? This is Silicon Valley. The subject is Silicon Valley. Well, if we think like a nation state or like a city state, we should be very concerned about what's happening with San Diego's troubles on the Mexican border. We should think about what the policy implications are of changes happening hundreds, thousands of miles away from Silicon Valley, because they can have a huge impact here. So what lies ahead? A lot of people look at this border thing, and we just saw some recent demographics where, California was for a couple of years here a minority majority state where there was no majority. We've now crossed over to a Hispanic majority in this state. And some people think this is what is ahead. We live in an absolute world. At least vodka companies think this is inevitable. Basically, the return to Mexico of everything stolen by the United States, via the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the Gadsden Purchase. It's a provocative image, but it misses the point. Think about that border region, San Diego, Mexicali, Tijuana. I don't know. Is it in fact Mexicali or Cali Baja? I don't know. But one thing I can tell you with certainty, Tijuana does not want to become American, and San Diego does not want to become Mexican. Rather, they just want to be one region, undistracted by national governments and people who are interfering with economic growth, educational opportunity, and social progress. The same things that we want here. As we go deeper into the day, just reflect on what this means for us. The new order is not about shifting boundaries. It's about dissolving boundaries. And we have played a big role in this. A big part of the reason why we're seeing this geopolitical change is that digital technology is proving to be the solvent, leaching the glue out of governmental structures, whether they are national structures, state structures, or local structures. We're doing a global rebalancing. And just as always, thanks to our myths and our geography, Silicon Valley is at the ground zero of this change. So thinking ahead, I would leave you with 2 thoughts, 2 tasks that we all need to consider. The first is we need to tend to our myths. It is not just about infrastructure and building and education. We need to tend to our myths because our myths are what fuel our future. We also need to cultivate our geography. We do need to think about regional arrangements, and Silicon Valley is a place that's always been in danger of drowning in the waste products of its success, and we have to pay close attention to that. But above all, we all as individuals and as businesses and as communities, we need to step up to the responsibilities that come with being a world-changing region in a world that is changing very rapidly and is counting on us all to do what we do best, to innovate, to throw out heresies, and keep inventing the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul Saffo. Thank you so much, Paul. We knew that you would be provocative. We knew that you would stimulate our thinking. We thank you truly. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to follow up these provocative remarks with a panel discussion. But band, give us a number while we get our panel on stage. Back in 2 minutes.